Manekshaw is my buddy tonight. Jehan, do you want to begin by presenting the continuing presence of Unrehearsed Futures in the web space, in the Zoom space?
I celebrate the continuing presence of Unrehearsed Futures in the web space. I celebrate all of you coming back and seeing regular faces because our dream is that this is not a webinar type thing, but it's much more of an ongoing conversation where everyone joins and everyone participates. And to that end, we are trying to get it to be much more participatory because the idea is to build a body of knowledge through this. That's one. I was spending his website, which Falguni can pop up onto the thing, but every single talk week by week is up there. So even if you miss one, you can still access it. I wish I could find a way to get it editable into a very nice, neat podcast, but they're just worth putting in your ear while you're chopping vegetables and stuff. Hi, Carol. I'm so happy you came back.
Hi, I'm sorry I cannot get on camera.
That's okay. You're here.
It's vanity, but I am very happy to be here. Very, very happy.
Yeah,
hi,
great.
Amy.
So
yeah, Jehan.
New York is here.
Yeah.
All kinds of places are here. But without further ado, really, also, if you think that there are people you would like to hear, and if there are conversations you want to have, just reach out to any of us, Amy, Ngeni, Wenya, whoever you fancy, me. And notice how I said whoever you fancy, and then I said me. And yeah, and just really keep the conversation alive and keep it going forward, because we're all on quests here to figure out how we want to, what we're going to do with this great unrehearsed future. So I shall leave it now to my partner in crime, Amy, to take us off and go.
Great, thank you, Jehan. So welcome to everybody, and to my guests this evening, Asher Warren and James Brennan. Thank you for appearing with me tonight in this Hobart and Launceston, Tasmania-centric session of Unrehearsed Futures. So this is number 5 of our second season, and it's entitled Carcerality, Ritual, and Spectatorship, Prisoners Coming Home. And so we're going to be looking, in the first half hour, we're going to be looking at the work of James and Asher, James in particular on carcerality and theater in prisons, and Asher on his work with audiences. And so I'd like to break with my tradition of reading out people's bios and ask my guests to introduce themselves, because I think that will be much more lively and interesting. So may I begin with you, James?
Sure.
Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Thanks, Amy, for the intro. I hope I have something to offer this room. It feels like an amazing, I can't really tell yet because I've shrunk everyone's heads, but it feels like there's a lot of experience and enthusiasm, wisdom in the room. So, hi. I'm in Tasmania in Australia, and one thing we do here when we speak on country, which is what they call, a word used here for the land here, is we acknowledge the traditional owners. So I'll do that even though we're everywhere, because I'm on this land here, and it's a practice that we try to honour at all times. So I'm paying my respect to the traditional and original owners of this land, Tasmania, specifically Hobart, the Lutruwita, the Mawinana people. And that means paying respect to those who've passed before, and also acknowledge the current Tasmanian traditional owners who are still here. The land was never really ceded. So it's important to start with that. It's also a pretty strong intro to my obsession with justice, because there's a lot of injustices happen on this country and continues to, but I'll get to that later. I'm going to try and talk about myself without as dispassionately as possible for the next little while. So I guess the intro, the main thing to say is, you know, I'm an artist. I've always been working as an artist, with an exception of a little break I had when I got bored, and I became a parole officer for a number of years. But mostly I trained as an actor, and I worked in the theatre for the last 20 years. I did a bit of straight theatre, and I found it pretty uninspiring. And I guess I started to make my own work early on. Well, as soon as I was training, really, and that came out of I guess disinterest in the work that was around me, or more, in a more constructive way, an interest in making work that was more physical and experimental than what was in where I trained, which was in Melbourne. Australia doesn't, you know, talking about theatre in Australia is it's a sort of an interesting thing to do. Asha might have something to say about that later as well. It's, you know, the tradition here is limited, and you might say that we might not be suited to certain types of theatre just because of our sort of national psyche and our history. Also, there's a lot of elephants in the room, which seems like a good thing for theatre, but in Australia, sometimes it hasn't been the case. Anyway, elephants in the room was something is something that's compelled me in all sorts of directions for the last 20 years. I'm a musician also, and I've always made and performed and composed music, but I decided early on that I would not study that afterwards because I wanted to keep it a bit sacred. Funnily enough, I did study theatre, and that's what I've been doing pretty much the whole time. So I was interested in mime and physical theatre early on, and I made my own theatre for a while, probably 10, 12 years off my own bat, and did that sort of continuously, and eventually got a bit jack of the culture. That means I didn't have enough contemporaries around that were doing what I wanted to do. So I had a break and went to Berlin and made music for quite a while. And when I came back, I actually just didn't want to make theatre. So I became a parole officer. That was a pretty sort of odd, there's a story there which I won't go into, but I didn't hunt it down. It sort of happened to me. It was great. If anyone ever wants to try and become a parole officer, if you're getting bored of theatre, I highly recommend it. I guess one thing that was missing for me in the theatre was a sense of danger or rawness in the work. And I didn't know this at the time, but when I went into the prison, well, those two things immediately changed for me. Of course, I made some pretty strict rules that I wasn't going in there to sort of harvest stories for my own theatre. I was having a break, but I loved it. I was, a little bit of context is when I worked in the community, I was managing offenders in the community. That meant people who'd come out of prison or people who were on community orders, and there was a whole range of sort of situations and people in quite a poor sort of crime, high crime neighbourhoods where I was working in the west of Sydney. I interview. The main task you do is you interview people. You get to know them, you get to know their backgrounds and the issues they have, and their, what's called in parole offending behaviour. You're supposed to understand that and anything that feeds into that. So I found it quite incredibly privileged sort of role to be able to get all this information about individuals. I just thought it was just so unusual. If anyone had handed me the files that I was reading years ago, I would have just been gobsmacked. There's so much information about people's lives, their personal stories, and it's compelling, you know, if it's compelling stuff. Of course, it's attached to a real person, so it's obviously very difficult material with real, you know, real risks involved in their lives. I eventually moved to the prison where I worked for 3 years, and that was a different story. Everyone was always on time. I didn't have to go out into the community finding people. They were all there. And my task there was to assess them for release. And so I really had to get my head around where they were at. And that really meant getting to know them quite well. You know, you got different sorts of parole officers. I think, you know, some of them probably thought I was a bit of a pushover because I was so interested in their, you know, their reasons and where they'd got to where they'd got. The reason I'm telling this story is because it really has driven everything I've done for the last 8 years. There was one interview in particular where a guy was involved in quite a serious series of crimes, and we'd got to this point of trust, and he broke down and confided in me some further crimes, which he hadn't been charged for. And I knew that I needed to report those crimes, those alleged crimes, and of course, I was able to tell him that after. But the thing that struck me was the interpersonal relationship between us had got to this point where something transformative was potentially unfolding. Unfortunately, it was not in my remit to go down that path, you know, to get stuck into whatever was unfolding for this guy. It was a breakthrough, in my opinion. He was facing something really significant. And as I left that interview, I mean, I knew that I was confident that this would not carry on in a way that I was interested in carrying on. That is, you know, getting people involved who understood the psychology of what was going on, etc., in order to sort of harness this transformative moment. Well, potentially transformative moment. As it played out, I went back and reported to the police, and, you know, the psychologists got involved, and nothing much came of it for him, that individual. I found that terribly disappointing. The one sort of moment that should be capitalised and sort of just everyone sort of gather around and pay attention to this moment wasn't able to be handled in the system that I was working in. That really led me to make a work called The Chat, which was a theatre work which was basically about inventing a utopian parole system. It was meant to be ludicrous, you know. We went all out, playing with the idea of what would make a utopian parole office: dancing, playing, games, sensuality, you know, all the things that you couldn't dream of when you're working in a parole office. It just doesn't match. But I was with a bunch of people who were well suited to those sort of things. And anyway, what came out of it was very surprising. It was made with including myself, 3 experienced performers and 4 ex-offenders. And we did multiple iterations of it. And so I worked with training up these ex-offenders to be ready for performance with my colleagues. And they were on stage every night with us, semi-structured performance, going into territory which was very sort of difficult, really, for them at moments, but also very uplifting at other moments. I guess the model of that has taken me into a sort of area of interest, which I would say is thinking about what the boundaries of my artistic ambition are. I think that my assessment of socially engaged art to date, I've generally hated it. You would not have caught me having any ambition to be involved in socially engaged art 10 years ago. Art for art's sake was what I was totally about. Unashamed about not having to answer why to that question. I just did not feel the need to answer why I was making art for art's sake. I thought it was enough. And I still would defend that position. But after making a few works with these people, my sense of purpose is completely different, and I don't think I can go back anymore. I can still make music which doesn't have socially engaged purpose, I think. But in theatre, because it is necessarily sort of collaborative, I can't really go back. So I found myself, I guess, now in a very, I just started the ethics from the ground up. I just tried to reflect on what I thought. And it took me years to get there, to get to being ready to do it. I just could not work out how to ethically start making work with people who'd been in prison. There's so much, it's so messy. I knew how messy it was going to be. And believe me, it's been even messier than I anticipated. Risk to myself and others involved is just a sort of daily reality. And the rewards, they're unlike working in theatre that I had done before. And so where I'm at now, I guess, is I'm doing a PhD about it. So I'm apparently applying some rigor to those questions. I still feel, probably as far away from understanding it as I did when I started, but probably I get to understand some other people's approach to some of the things that I care about inside it. And I'll continue to do it. I think I made a decision to keep doing this. I thought long and hard about whether this would be a flash in the pan a couple of years. And I decided, no, that I was going to keep doing this. So here I am. I'm just launching an organisation. I'm moving away from my own name as an artist, which I think my website is up there, what's been for the last sort of while, to a company name. And the idea there is to put a bit of distance between James and the work, because, and I'll finish on this idea, I think, because basically what's happened is, by working with people in prison and who've been in prison and who are in and out of prison, the idea of trust and my decision in the end to have real friendships with these people, not the professional boundaries that make sense in the work, has been really integral part of my work. Not one that I would put in funding application, mind you, or necessarily write about in my, maybe I will write about it in my PhD, but it has led to some really difficult situations recently in the last year, which I hadn't second guessed. And there's probably more of those, but each time so far, when I've stumbled and thought, geez, how can I move through this? I've taken enough time to decide that I want to, and I will. And so I'm just starting this organisation. The first things we're going to be doing is dedicating the first period to music making in prison. Prisoners love music. All the stuff comes out. They get to learn a bit of, songwriting, whatever. And it's a real joy, Music does something that theatre has a lot of trouble doing. The immediate response is just great. So anyway, that's a bit of a ramble. I think I should shut up now. There's probably other stuff to talk about. I hope that's a useful intro. I sort of wanted to reveal some of my sort of, I guess, more personal reasons for doing this stuff.
Yeah, that's wonderful. Thanks. Thank you. No, I think it's very helpful to know your background and your personal experience that connects you to the work. And I'm sure that already you've provoked a lot of thoughts about things. Asher, can I ask you to also introduce yourself and your research?
With pleasure. Can everybody hear me okay? Thumbs up? All good? Fantastic. Amy, I don't think that I have as a compelling story as James has. I might be a bit briefer. Is that okay?
It's fine.
Okay. So my name's Asher Warren. I teach theatre and performance at the University of Tasmania, the same island state that James lives in, but we do not reside in the same city. I live in Launceston and teach in Launceston, which is in the north, but is also land which was stolen. The Palawa people were forcibly dispossessed here, and I want to acknowledge the traditional owners as well. I like to start with my name in these kind of things, because my name gives a lot away and hides a lot. My first name is Asher, and a lot of people sometimes think that's back to front, but my given name is Asher, and it is the Hebrew Asher from the Old Testament. But it is not, I am not Jewish, my family is not Jewish. My family is actually hidden behind my surname, which is Warren, which was anglicised when my grandfather landed from Holland in Melbourne, Australia, after the Second World War. It was changed to the closest thing in the phone book, to Van Vuren, which was the Dutch name. So this is to kind of situate myself as a second generation Australian with a heritage which I have a distant relationship to, but still is a part of the identity that I have here. My work up until a couple of years ago was really focused on interactive and intermedial theatre making, participatory theatre, and people working, particularly Australian artists, working to make really innovative work, which was remarkably open in its structure. Participants actually got drawn into these works and had quite a lot of say in what happened. They could determine where that work went. Every time those works were staged, something different would happen. So I spent quite a lot of time watching those works, participating in those works, and looking at what this meant for theatre as a practice, for performance as a practice, once it started becoming so much more dependent, so much more formally dependent on how participants engaged. And like actually James said, it really drew out the collaborative nature of performance practice in a much more kind of concrete way. So that's always been a strong interest of mine. What draws people to the theatre? What do they do in the theatre? Not necessarily just the artists, but audiences. In 2018, I got a job at the University of Tasmania, an island which I had never lived on, knew of, had visited, and started working here and experienced essentially a form of culture shock, which was an entirely different culture of theatre making. I'd come from a large major city to a much more regional city and encountered a very, very different set of attachments to theatre making, expectations of theatre, and ways of valuing the work. And since then, this has really kind of like reoriented me to start asking the same kinds of questions about what are you doing at the theatre? Why are you making theatre? What are you doing when you go to the theatre? Of this set of regional audiences. So this has kind of been my recent turn. And it has been really interesting engaging with this regional theatre culture because it is remarkably self-sufficient. It's so kind of powerfully self-contained. It doesn't need external validation. But what that has meant for me as a scholar and a critic is that I'm not necessarily always welcome. And it's been very difficult for me to become a part of this community and to engage with the community. I think I'll stop there because I think you have some questions for us, Amy.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's very interesting that you stop there because because I think I have an excessively ambitious list of questions, but when you speak of having difficulty feeling part of a community, that leads me to wonder what theater is for, and I think that's something that you might have different answers for that question, and then it'll be interesting to find out what the room thinks about it. But when we talked about this before, actually, you talked about a kind of cruel optimism. And so I was wondering if you would segue into that reflection on
Yeah,
yeah.
certainly. So yes, this is to borrow Lauren Ballant's wonderful, wonderful phrase, cruel optimism. I first started thinking about our attachments to the theatre when I had been ruminating on a series of uncomfortable moments, watching work in Melbourne, actually, some which were very awkward. One where a elderly audience member got up and walked out of a show during a performance, and the actor on stage turned to her and addressed her and said, "Thanks for coming, great to see you. Mind your step on the way out." And I was torn because I felt, yeah, you shouldn't walk out, but you know, just go on. You've taken us out of the moment of the show for actually like a pretty self-serving go, right? Like you're doing this for you. This is meant to be about us. And so I had this, I've called them in this paper that I wrote about this, I had a sneaky feeling. And it was this feeling that scratched at what was happening on stage and took me out of the suspended disbelief that I had given, and I couldn't stop thinking about it. I was in, but not in that moment. And so I all of a sudden, as soon as I started thinking about these sneaky feelings where you're watching a show and all of a sudden you're not there because something has broken the effective machinery of the theatre, I realized it related a lot to the kind of attachment that we have and the willingness that we bring to the theatre to kind of get something. And we have this expectation, and I think the cruel optimism sums it up nicely, because we have such high hopes for theatre to deliver us moments of beauty, of insights, of pathos, of bathos. And so often, at least in my experience, they don't happen. I sit through a lot of bad theatre, and this is perhaps because I sit through a lot of student theatre. But I continually return and sit with this kind of optimism that it will happen. That optimism is really different in Tasmania, because it seems much easier to satisfy, and that bothers me. People don't have as higher hopes of the theatre, and so they are kind of, more readily satisfied. Their optimism is direct. Yeah, no, I won't say that. I might give that to James now.
Well, I'll say one thing about that. I'm fascinated by those moments, and I think that they are compelling theatrically. And I think I probably have obsessed a little bit about capturing them and working them for my own theatrical purposes. Because, when you've got shit theatre and that can still happen, you've sort of got good theatre because it is compelling. That moment is absolutely, it's awkward, sure. But, you're paying attention, and there's a lot of tension. There's tension, there's uncertainty, there's surprise, and, it's got all the ingredients that make my ears prick up in the theatre. So I think when you described that, I was like, ooh, that's interesting. I mean, I'd do something with that, couldn't you? And I think that I in the theatre I've made in the last years, I've been really playing with the inadequacies or the elephants in the room as content and as form, really, because I know that they work in this context anyway. You know, I'm absolutely obsessed with high art, beautifully performed, impeccable theatre. I love it. I want to make it. I want to be in it. I want to like live it, but it's not happening in Tasmania right now. I'm just like, forget about it. And that's where I live. Now, what have you got then? Well, you got that, what you've just described. And I don't think that's the answer to how we make good theatre here, but it's a little window into your question, Amy, of what's art for. I mean, I don't really know what art's for. I don't think I'll ever know, but I did become obsessed with what art can do. And at the moment, I'm like, I have sort of social purpose in my work, and I know there's some things it can do, and I've learned about a few. It can make someone who's marginalised feel part of something. It can make money for someone who doesn't make money. It can, you know, there's all these sort of practical things, and then there's more ambitious things. But so I guess when I reframe your question as can do, it really changes things for me. And I think that my ambition, which has changed in the last 8 years, has landed on that, because I never had any interest in working out what art was for, what it was. I was just like, I'm in it. It's cool. Art's cool. I like it. But when I found purpose, then I'm like, well, actually, I've got some tasks now, and how can I do them using some of the stuff I got? So it's interesting to go. I don't know if I want to go deeper into Ash's moment or take it away, but it is, to me, fascinating stuff. The awkwardness that Asher is obsessed with, I would say. Is that fair to say, Asher? Those moments of awkwardness.
Yeah, obsession. Yep.
Yeah, positive. Obsession's a good thing in my mind. I think that, you know, they're the clues to our little tiny crappy palette, theatrical palette that we have in Australia. You know, you got that's one of the little things you probably want to keep on the palette, or train up and be, you know, brilliant, you know, mimetic experts.
I feel like there's something else that I want to add to that question that you've raised, James, which is theatre is good at creating communities, performance events, and the act of making theatre is an amazing moment of bringing people together with a shared purpose, because it takes so much energy. Like, how can you not be invested? But for me, the interesting thing about that is that the cohesiveness of that group that comes together in the groups that I'm seeing around me are exclusive and exclusionary, and they're based around so often a kind of, we are separating ourselves in order to define ourselves more clearly as something, and that has been the real kind of trouble, because I see it when I see the students that I have audition for these shows and they're excluded because they're not in with those people, or they've said something about a show that they didn't like, or that there was, you know, they've raised a criticism and they're not allowed to, they're blacklisted. So the kind of like, you know, the two sides of creating communities around an identity, when those identities are, you know, complicated or, you know, clearly defined, they're also methods of exclusion.
There's some very interesting questions already in the chat about a question being raised about social engineering in terms of the creating of community around theater. And then also a question about utopia, or reflection on utopia on your part, Mwenya. The room is small enough that I just think it would be really wonderful if people would just unmute themselves and speak out the question. I don't think I'd need to curate from the chat. So I'd appreciate that if people would just sort of, basically unmute to make their reflections. Jehan, did you want to?
How does the hierarchy work? Most interesting question, or the one at the top?
I try to go from the top. So okay. Jehan, I think you were the first.
I actually think maybe because I'll speak at some point, but maybe we can go with Clark, because I haven't just open it up to people non-curatorial. I don't know. Otherwise I can go, but up to you, Amy, you decide.
Okay. Well, I think then I would be asking Mwenya if you wanted to talk a little bit about your question about utopia, whether there's a utopian quality in the projects that are being described. That is, you're pointing to.
It's the other side.
I'm pointing to Mbongeni, who is right here on my screen.
Yeah, hi. Thank you both for those really kind of rich initial kind of opening thoughts. And I guess, Asha, what I was hearing as you're kind of thinking around this question around, I guess, and James picked it up, what work does the theatre do? And perhaps this connects to a question of ethics, right? Is we can engage in art for art's sake, but we also seem to be recognizing that perhaps that's an insufficient grounding for an ethical practice of theatre making. It's the question I'm asking, right? But I immediately suddenly thought of Jill Dolan's, I put the book in the comments, The Utopian Performance, Finding Hope at the Theatre, where she kind of engages with exactly what it means to approach the theatre with, I guess, to use the term you're using, cruel optimism, and still somehow, even in the recognition that perhaps the performance event doesn't leave anything that's specifically tangible afterwards, that there is some kind of utopian impulse that allows us to generate something hopeful, something meaningful, just in the act of gathering together. And I think the words she uses are embodied, passionate, and live in the same space. There's an interesting tension there, right? This desire for the work to be larger than itself, but also recognizing that the fact of sharing space in and of itself is perhaps beginning to crack open the ethics and politics of what we're doing when we're sitting in those spaces together. It also connects to, I've lost the train of thought, but yeah, so there's that kind of interesting tension for me between this kind of cruel optimism and the utopian impulse, nevertheless, that perhaps might emerge in spite of the cruelty of that optimism.
Yeah, or precisely because of. Is it Helen Ibol, or there's a great phrase talking about one-on-one theatre that came out of some research about the desire to give good audience when you attend the theatre. And I had a lovely conversation with a friend a little while ago who found it, he just couldn't explain why he was so disappointed in the show. And he puzzled and spent the time interrogating himself and interrogating what he saw to process his thinking. And it was like, I was at that show too, and it wasn't underdone work. It wasn't fully kind of fleshed out, and it really needed more time. But he felt bad in that moment to kind of like not have a good response to it. And I was struck by him feeling bad as that utopian impulse, right? Like that's the manifestation of the utopian theatrical impulse, that you've internalized this desire for it to be good, like so much so that you're kind of pained by it.
I'm
I think the problem is not enough people. Sorry, I feel like there's not enough people that feel bad about bad theatre.
Can I add a thought there? I think that when you add social purpose, let's just say social purpose to a theatre work, your right and almost responsibility to be that sort of crude, real audience who just, you know, like in old times, you know, you look away or have a beer when it's boring and you clap when it's good. I think that the contract has changed, that there is a different requirement on audience now when there is social purpose inside the work, and that has to do with the ambitions of the work itself. You have, in a way, and you know, and theatre. Look, a lot of socially engaged theatre, I'd say, including some of what I doesn't necessarily always do a good job of conveying all of the ambitions and all of the history of the work that would lead you as an audience to be responsible for that. However, it doesn't change the fact that when something is made and it has a purpose which is way beyond entertainment, then this is a question really, then possibly the contract is shifted. You know, what is now, if that's the case, if the work is aiming to create a precedent for reform, for example, and it was an experiment that is to be tested and applied in a real context, a political context or a social context, then surely that would shift that contract in a way. If you are an audience member who gives a shit about that stuff, then. So I guess what I'm getting at there is maybe we're not in that same state anymore. Our right to entertainment has shifted. We can't, as audience, we can't respond. Surely the audience role has shifted. If we assume the artist role has shifted and that we can no longer just make art for art's sake, then perhaps then there's an implication for the audience too. I'm not saying, well, I'm not sure what I'm saying there, but it's really a question, and I imagine that there's a bit of mixing up with artists at the moment, and it's socially engaged art generally, about what is trying to be achieved. I've seen a lot of socially engaged art which is thinking it's going to do something, and I'd say it doesn't do that. And then the audience goes, well, you wanted to change the world and you didn't do anything. So what, you know, I'm going to look to the entertainment, and it wasn't entertaining. So sorry. And I think when I talk about utopia, I'm really talking about the attempt to jump past a problem, because art can do that. You can launch yourself beyond the usual obstacles to a possible answer. And you don't have to get involved in all of the obstacles. I mean, that's what we do. That's what I've been doing with some of the former prisoners, is that we don't have to focus on their offending. We can just leave that all completely out and get them to focus on their positive traits. Now, you can't do that in prison, but that's utopian, right? But it does come up with some solutions.
James, I'm going to direct the utopian reference to Clark's question in the chat. I'm having trouble reading the chat. Clark, do you want to unmute yourself? And thank you.
Yes. I recall reading in the description for this workshop something about returning rituals for ex-prisoners. And I think that was in reference to your work, James.
Yeah.
I was wondering if you could say something about that. I found that very interesting as a notion coming from a theater perspective. I'd be really interested to hear about that work.
Well, thanks for the question, Clark. It's research really at the moment. Some of the work I've done to date, I would describe it as reintegration rituals for the people taking part. it wasn't intended to be that, but it sort of turned out that way. And what that really means is that the feedback and the sort of evaluation of the project revealed that the process and the outcomes of the art had the effect of integrating them both internally and externally. And what that means varies greatly, but there's an internal reintegration, I think, for them, which is just them going, sometimes it's just as simple as, I'm not a bad person. I'm not an all bad person. And they sort of work something out internally. And externally, it can be as simple as working in a group and what that does for a person who's not used to having a cohesive social experience. The research at the moment, which Asher is well aware of because he's involved, is seeing if I can sort of answer the question about whether or not performance, and experimental performance in particular, can serve as a reintegration ritual for former prisoners. And the idea there is that to build a ritual with a prisoner and work with them to develop and deliver it on release from prison. And what is a ritual? I don't quite know yet. I mean, I'm studying it, but I can't tell you. And I think it can be something as small as a handshake and something as big as the biggest parade you've seen in your life. It's I hope to try and make something that is really at the end of the research, there's going to be an example which sort of tests out the findings, I guess. So I think that the research is just applying pressure to the concept. The reality is that I think that my work, in some ways, doing it each time I'm doing it, I need to learn more about what ritual can do and what it is, in order to be more confident about speaking about this stuff. But that's sort of really it, I guess. Did that make any sense?
Well, it certainly did make sense to me, James, and I'm really glad you're doing that work, and I'll be fascinated to read about your discoveries and to hear about them. Thank you for doing that work.
Appreciate you saying that.
Clark's someone who knows quite a bit about ritual and theater. That's basically specialty, isn't it, Clark?
Well, I sort of cross applied theater and psychodrama, and so a lot of the heightened aspects of communal experience that are captured in that mode of working. Yeah, so that really intrigued me. But I think I'll leave it there just to say I'm really excited about hearing about your work there, James.
Oh, thank you.
I think it's very interesting that we've gone from a discussion of utopia to hope to healing. There's a kind of, we seem to be in that terrain. There's the idea that there's something called bad theater has sparked some thoughts here. Veronica, can you unmute yourself to talk about your problem with the notion of bad theater, or do you want me to read out the chat?
Sure. Hi. So I think it's pretty much encapsulated in what I've written there, but it also strikes me that it is to do with the tension between process and product. And so the idea of creating rituals for re-entering society, or creating rituals that have to do with perhaps psychodrama, or to be in a process where people are asked to be socially reintegrating or kind of learning about themselves, which is very much process driven, sometimes needs a product to fulfill a contract to themselves in the process. And that may be bad theatre, but it's in the eye of the beholder. And so I really have a problem with the idea of bad.
Sorry, Veronica, you've gone mute.
Oh, sorry about that. And so I have a problem with this idea of bad or good theatre, because in a multicultural, multilingual, multi-everything society, and across the world with the enormous numbers of aesthetic choices, the range of cultural forms of expression, when I hear bad theatre as a term, and sorry, Asha, I'm not getting on your case, or maybe I am, I don't know. But I start to think, okay, it bugs me because I always think it's to do with a Western benchmark, with the Northern Hemisphere, Western dominance of aesthetic criteria. And it really annoys me because the Global South or whoever are often judged, and applied theatre is often judged. And I unapologetically use the word applied theatre because, really life is complicated. Let's just accept that there's problems with the term. But when it's, that it's bad theatre, why is applied theatre bad theatre so often? Well, to whom is it bad? And how do we consider the context of what process has been followed in order to make that piece of work? For whom is it most important? Is it for a fee-paying audience, a ticket-buying audience? And then why have they come to that? If they've come as an act of solidarity, well, then who cares if it's bad? If they've come to be entertained, well, they shouldn't have come if they wanted mindless or aesthetic high art. All these terms really begin to frustrate me as a practitioner, also with ex-prisoners here in Cape Town. So that's my 10 cents worth.
Thank you, Veronica. James, do you want to answer that?
I just have one. I just have one thing to say about that. Really, is that it reminds me when you go and see a show made by kids. No one hates it. Right? I think just because they understand it. They understand it fully. They know what's going on. So I use that sometimes because when you go and see your nephew or just anyone's nephew or kid's theatre, your enthusiasm is flowing from goodwill and adoration and also an understanding of the context. I think you fully understand the context and the process. And so I think I only say that, Veronica, as an example of when there is full understanding, then sometimes there can be really high enthusiasm and goodwill from an audience. Doesn't have to always be goodwill. It can be an alternative. When they're grown up, those same kids grown up, I think that the goodwill can be replaced with other things. But it can be, it can come. I think, going back to that other point, I think coming from understanding, and maybe that's a role of the artist to spend more time working out how they can convey what they think needs to be known about that artwork, not just the artistic outcomes, for example, and finding interesting ways to enter into a dialogue with the audience, maybe beforehand, maybe as a ramping into the work, maybe as a conversation after, or whatever. I think just judging it on the work itself is always going to be troubling for someone.
Jenny, I'd like to move on to your comment, but I just want to first ask Asher if you'd like to reply.
Yeah, I think so. I think it's probably like, I really appreciate the distinction, and I think it's great to call that out, because I don't think I mean bad theatre in a vague term. I think the theatre that bothers me the most is unthinking theatre, and theatre that does not engage with its purpose. And so last week was the 25th anniversary of a pretty horrific event in Tasmanian history, which all of Australia saw, which was the Port Arthur massacre, where 35 people were killed by a gunman. It led to, the gun laws which Australia has now, which is something good that is an outcome, but a horrific event and a kind of, Australia's kind of most violent historical gun crime. And last night I went to the theatre and I saw a local company stage the play Gloria. And I'm not sure if anybody's familiar with Gloria. It won some awards in the States, but it is centered around a massacre in an office in a New York publishing house. And that show last night told the story of the play, but did not acknowledge its context in Tasmania. It made no reference in the program. It made no attempt to kind of bridge the gap to what relevance that has to us here, what it means to tell that story here and now, the week after we're commemorating this, act of violence. And for me, that was unthinking. That was a chance to make a show that connected to a community and people here. And it didn't need, they didn't need to do good accents. They didn't need to stage it well. They just needed to think about who they're telling that story for and why that story should be told. And so, yeah, I agree. There's lots and lots of criteria we could measure from, but so to step back, that's the shorthand that I am trying to sum up when I say bad theatre. Theatre that doesn't think about what it's doing and where it's doing it. And this is, I think that this is what applied theatre does very, very well. It's very clear about what it's doing and where it's doing it.
That seems to segue really perfectly into what your comment is, Jenny. Do you want to unmute yourself?
Yeah, I think Asher came to me then that rather than bad theatre, we should think about lazy theatre, that it's lazy and that it's not making those connections. I just made a comment about the fact of we training a lot of us as educators in this space. We're training new young performers. We're training them in skills as actors or in theatre makers and theatre creators. But perhaps we also need to maybe be spending more time than we do at the moment in getting them to think critically about what they're seeing and to be demanding more of that as an audience. I'm certainly a little like what you said, James, about theatre in Melbourne, which is where I am. I don't go to see the major theatre companies because I don't want to spend a lot of money going to a play which has not been thought through properly, as you just said, Asher, about that, or a director's I've got a great idea, let's set, Shakespeare's play in this particular context, but actually haven't thought about it at all. And you've got lots of money and the person right next to you who's in a wonderful big job with lots of money sits down and goes to sleep. And they've paid $90 for the ticket. That's not what theatre is about. But I think audiences aren't critical enough in this country or pushing us enough to demand something that has a resonance from the work. And I guess that's just me thinking through what's my job as an educator with young people that may not have seen a lot of theatre don't go and go, oh yeah, that's great, just because it cost me $150 and had lots of moving parts, it's great theatre. Not necessarily. So just trying to get those cogs kind of working, which is, you know, for me as well. So, yeah.
Thanks for that. Yeah, Mgeni, do you want to, so Frank mentioned that perhaps we should be using the terms unthinking or thoughtless theater instead of bad. That seems.
I think it was Asher's point. I was agreeing with Asher after using the term thinking.
Okay.
I added thoughtless, which is just a synonym of.
Yes, indeed. Mgeni,
I like lazy as well. I think that's good.
Yeah, I guess I was agreeing along the same lines and trying to find, I was also kind of riffing on and calling back to, I think, a point that James made about the frustration of not feeling like you're a part of that community or not finding the points of access. And I'm now sitting here wondering whether that maybe isn't the exact political function that this work could potentially serve. Is that I think our expectation of the contract between performer and audience is usually founded in some kind of process of identifying with, right? It's proximity, it's all these things. And I wonder whether that breaking of the aesthetic frame of this kind of theater, whether we read that as, you know, the invocation of bad theater tactics or whatever it might be, is to position us exactly in that place where we recognize that we are in a context where we're engaging with people who ultimately, for various reasons of statehood, and you know, we can discuss those ad nauseum, are actually within a carceral economy that positions them radically differently to where we ourselves are sitting. So I wonder if that constant breaking of the frame, whether it's because the work doesn't meet our tastes or doesn't meet, you know, the aesthetic markers of good theater, of I like this lazy theater term as well. I think it's more precise analytically. Is about that being the utopian gesture of this theater that fails, right? Is that the failure is the work. It's that refusal to allow us to slip into the fantasy that we might occupy the same subject position as people. And perhaps as a function of that, begin ignoring the very real kind of national, global economies of carcerality, right? That have produced this scenario in the very first place.
I mean, no, go. Someone's saying something.
James, no, I just no, stay with it because I want to take it somewhere else, I think. But
I mean, I just feel like provoking myself and you now, and in response to that. I mean, I think to what end? Oh, everyone's gone. Can you see me still? Oh,
yeah.
I guess to what end? You know, those exercises of the imagination in terms of utopia and theatre making are, you know, the stuff that we're all, I think, familiar with as starting points and sometimes as endpoints of our work. And if you apply that, I mean, we're getting in these terms about bad theatre and lazy theatre or thoughtless theatre, or, you know, maybe brave theatre or whatever. They are intentions, right? You know, they don't necessarily have embedded modes of gauging outcomes or successes necessarily, and they're aspirational. And I think we don't necessarily or want aspirational theatre. In my case, I accidentally, in the last work I made, which was very problematic, I think, but I decided that we accidentally landed on a potentially a strategy that could be applied to parole unit. Definitely not in this current climate, but we landed on this thing basically, which was an interview technique, which I decided I'm going to pursue that and see if I can put some structure and formality around it and write it down and get some academics on board and put it down for posterity and try and plug it that, you know, one day maybe this this is not a plug, but if you want to buy the book, you can. Maybe one day someone will go, you know what? We should try that weird theatre thing out because our parole office is not working that well. Why don't we try that interview technique that those theatre guys made up? Yeah. Now, that sounds far-fetched. I don't think it is. I really don't think it is. I've worked in a parole office and I know there are imaginative people in there. I guess my point is when you have aspirations inside an artistic context, I think it's a fun idea and an important idea to see how you can peg that to the wall somehow and see where it sticks. Because the life of an artistic work, we all know, has limits. It just comes and goes. And it doesn't really necessarily mean that much socially in some ways. But if you can crystallize something into something that's applicable, then you can gauge what you're not able to gauge inside the art making process. I've just never been, it's impossible to know whether you made anything that's worth anything when you're making art. But if you sort of join a line from something you're making out into a measurable, something that you care about, in my case, criminal justice, then you've got this sort of parallel universe that you can crystallize this work, this good work that you're making in the real world. And when I say the real world, that can be the stage too, but I think that's one of my ambitions anyway. I'm trying to work out ways of doing that. And of course, I'm not the first.
Nikita, sorry, has had her hand up for a long time, and I'm sorry, did she just disappear? Nikita, did you want to unmute yourself?
I'm right here. Yes, I'm here. I actually wanted to speak right after Jenny because she brought up a really good point. So I practice in India, and I have had conducted workshops in correction homes and especially worked with women in correction centers. And I think what I struggle with is that it is intentional theater. I understand that. In India, I think it's different because the authorities themselves don't understand it. So a lot of time there's a lot of backlash from the authorities saying, why do you want to do this? What's the point of corrective justice? And to actually add to that, another point is that there aren't spaces that also train you for it. So when I began, I think 7 years back, the biggest problems I faced was I did not also know how to, I was facilitating, but I also knew that I was filling myself with a lot of stories and there weren't avenues to go and take care of myself at times. Also something I constantly worried about was, what if I opened a can of worms that I wasn't even prepared to handle? I figured ways out. In India, there aren't many places that you can actually get trained for applied arts. So now whenever I work, I make sure that I work with a psychologist or a counselor in the room so that if a can of worms is open, there is someone to handle that. But something I still do struggle with is when I'm filled up to the brim. I really don't know where to take that, and I worry that it might affect the work. And so I was just wondering if there are any thoughts on that.
Nikita, thank you so much. That's such an interesting experience. James, you mentioned how messy it is when you get involved in these projects.
Yeah. Yeah. Hi, Nikita. I'd say that, I mean, we've probably been doing it for the similar amount of time, Nikita. 7 years is about the amount of time I've been making theatre in prison. I guess I came to it with some, having encountered a bunch of these stories before I did it. So I wasn't desensitized, but I saw a lot and heard a lot working in prison that prepared me, I guess. But I think it's hard to, you know, in parole, the system for decompressing was to talk to colleagues because they know the territory. And so you just find yourself recounting these horrific stories, and that was just part of the culture. And that helped somehow. So I would say that talking to someone about them who you trust is a good start. And there's obviously, you know, you have to think about your own ethics about that and what you can say and can't say. And but I think it's important for you, if you want to keep doing the work, that you have some way of sharing it, because it can be really hard, can't it?
Yes, yes. That does help, James. Thank you. I think that's also what I just by instinct do, that I talk to. I make sure that I have a therapist who can take care of me so that I am also ready to then take care of the work that they do.
I can share a couple of little tricks of mine, which I'm happy to tell you, which are just part of my practice. And when I'm working with prisoners, I have a couple of rules, and one is that they can tell the truth or lie at any time. And that way, I don't know if this horrific story is theirs or if it's really happened, or it's just something they want to express. And so that gives also, I mean, also you've got to think about them. It gives them space to tell or not tell, or tell in a particular way, because I think when we go in as theatre makers, they think that we want everything. We want to know all the gory details. And so I think I've tried to make boundaries myself and tell them up front, you don't have to tell me a story here. You're working with me as an artist, and we're going to work on making art together. So sometimes that's helped.
That's a wonderful thing. Thank you so much for sharing that, James.
Pleasure.
That's great. And Nikita, you've seen Veronica's reference to Sheila Preston.
Yes, I'm just looking that up.
Okay, so I think we are at our limit in terms of our time. We don't have a hard stop in this discussion. We then have a post show discussion, so no one needs to leave. But I think it's appropriate for me to, at this point, thank very much my two guests, James Brennan and Asher Warren. Thank you so much for joining.
Thanks so much. So much for having us both. It felt a real great pleasure to be in this room with all of you, everywhere.
Thank you to the room for all of the wonderful remarks and participation. It's just been a really nourishing evening. And I wanted to mention that we have decided to make a bit of a shift at Unrehearsed Futures and put a call out to people in the room if they would like to co-facilitate with us, especially if they have people in mind that they would like to invite onto the discussion, that we can actually start collaborating with you. Because it is not our intention to create a weekly webinar, but rather to create an ongoing discussion with people becoming more and more, having more and more echo effect of previous discussions and a deeper and deeper enriched field of conversation. So I'm going to put the email address of my organization, info@embodiedpoetics.org, into the chat. Please, if you have any ideas, if you'd like to co-facilitate with me or one of my wonderful co-curators at any point, please do get in touch and suggest yourself. That would be a great pleasure to us to hear from you. So thank you so much to DSM and to Falguni for the continuing support of this project, and to my fellow curators, Jehan and Mgeni and Wenya, thank you for being here tonight. There's Geni's email as well. And I think we will close with that. And as I said, I'm just going to stick around. So if you'd like to, you can too. Thanks again.
Do we want to plug next week's session?
Oh, yes, sorry. So next week, please do that, Jehan.